He's a dreadnought in human form. He's a guided missile against the missile factories and the military-industrial complex. He's the independent writer and analyst and very popular guest on the mother of all talk shows, Bryce Greene. Bryce, welcome back. I want to ask you first about something that's just been brought to my attention. Somebody called Ned Price, who is the State Department's spokesman, who said this today, and I'm watching his lips move as he says it. No country on earth has done more to build a more stable, more integrated Middle East than the United States of America. That may be the most preposterous statement ever made in the history of US governance. Discuss.
Now, there have been a lot of preposterous statements made by the U.S. government, but yeah, like you say, this one takes the cake. I mean, U.S. interference in the Middle East, I mean, they took their mantle from the British at the end of World War II, and since then you've seen the deposing of democratic governments like the one in Iran in the 50s, and you've seen interventions like the funding of radical terrorists, radical jihadis in the 80s to draw Russia into the quote-unquote Afghan trap. And then you saw the U.S. starving of Iraq during the 90s. Then you see the brutal invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq in the 2000s. I mean, and then you go to Syria and to Libya. I mean, the list goes on. This is just an objectively absurd thing to say. But it's something that the empire has to believe when a country like China is actively making peace, taking the real steps required to see peace and stability in that region. If American imperial planners are serious about the truth, well, I mean, they would have to take a serious look at their own actions, and then they'd have to conclude that, well, there's something wrong here. But I believe it was Upton St. Clair who said, it's difficult to convince somebody of something when their paycheck depends on them not understanding it.
Very good. I like that one. Now, you made a number of brilliant points there. Let me go through them, if I may. This is the 20th anniversary of the US-UK invasion and occupation of Iraq, which has cost 1 million people their lives, has sent ISIS and Al-Qaeda physically and also their mindset cascading around the world, fanaticizing, extremizing people, leading to terrorist eruptions around the world. The war in Iraq is not over yet. And I saw David Frum, the former choir boy of the George W. Bush administration, concede that it was a blunder. Of course, it was worse than a blunder. It was a crime. To paraphrase Talleyrand. But is that common now? Are we finding mea culpa amongst the former chorus of George W. Bush that it was a blunder?
There are a lot of people who are insane enough and callous enough to call it just a mere blunder, that maybe this was the American empire acting in good faith, and, you know, not with any ill intention, not with any malice in its heart. And, you know, I can't remember which commentator it was, but someone, it might have been Frum, he called it a mild success in terms of strengthening Iraqi democracy. Of course, what's left out of the conversation is that even conservative estimates of the death toll in Iraq crosses the 500,000 mark. And you're still seeing people being born with birth defects due to the munitions that America used during the brutal war. And so for people to whitewash the disgusting history that was the Iraq War, that was the global war on terror, which, you know, ended up creating far more terror than it stopped. For people to just whitewash that, I mean, that tells you a lot about the state of American political thought. The idea that someone like George W. Bush and the criminals in his administration would be able to be sanitized is insane. I mean, now he's just an old man who paints, and people will laugh, and when he'll make gaffes about how there was a brutal and unjustified invasion of Iraq, I mean Ukraine. I mean that's just there's a slapstick element to all of this. Is that the empire has a short memory, and the stenographers in the media, they tend to perpetuate this. Now, to be fair, there are a lot of serious mea culpas. There are a lot of people who do understand that this was a horrible, malicious event based on lies. But even then, it's a mild critique because they'll say that this was an aberration. It was a one-off. It was based on the idiosyncrasies of the Bush administration and the people running it, rather than an inherent part of how American capitalism and how the American military-industrial complex and how the oil majors operate all around the globe. That history is obscured because if they were really to confront that, they'd have to look in the mirror today. They'd have to see the control of the control that oil majors and oil interests and military interests have over the direction of U.S. foreign policy. They'd have to look at the actual individuals who were involved in it. And if they were to be serious, they would be calling all the time the fact that Victoria Nuland was one of the main people generating support for the Iraq war as an advisor to Dick Cheney. Well, where is she now? Well, now she is directing Eastern European policy under the Biden administration. And she has a lot to do with the problems that we see in Ukraine today. So it's the same people who are there making the same mistakes, driving the insane policy that we're still dealing with. But there doesn't seem to be any sort of real reckoning about any of that.
Well, it's the Biden administration that is about to call the latest U.S. warship the Fallujah. Fallujah being the place above all others where children are born every single day, some of them with their brains outside of their head, with their vital organs outside of their body, deformed because of the great war crimes that the United States committed against the people of Fallujah. So, hey, let's celebrate. Let's break a bottle of champagne across the bows of the new warship, the SS Fallujah, under the Democrats, under Lloyd Austin, under Joe Biden.
Well, it's important to remember who Lloyd Austin is. Lloyd Austin, he is first and foremost a Raytheon executive. That the idea that the civilian administration of the military is separate from the people in uniform is completely bunked when you have the revolving door as clear and obvious as it is there. But to this question of naming the ship, I mean, that just shows you how craven these people are. And the American military has a long history of appropriating the names of its victims into its own structure. I mean, we have, remember, Apache helicopters. Well, who were the Apaches? They were a group of indigenous people that were wiped out in part by American military forces. Then you have the Tomahawk missile. I mean, the list goes on. It's just a clear demonstration about just how brutal the American empire is and how little it cares about the people it trods on, from Iraq to the native population of America to the Vietnamese. To pick a country, pick almost any country in the world. There is a direct line between U.S. imperialism and the problems that it's facing today.
Now, speaking of ships, we now discover, this was, I think, the first time we met when we talked about the Nord Stream, we now discover that Seymour Hersh was way off beam. It was a guy on a yacht what done it. It was a guy on a yacht that dived 200 feet into the sea. It was a guy off a yacht that had the devastating wherewithal to penetrate the concrete casing, to know exactly where to blow and create the world's greatest methane leak and destroy 20 billion euros worth of Germany's vital infrastructure. Who knew, Bryce?
Well, this has been a very interesting whodunit. Well, let's just run back through what happened. In September of last year, the Nord Stream pipeline was found to be damaged and leaking a lot of gas, and it was quickly established that this was a deliberate act. And you look at the Western press, and what was the first thing that they said? They said that it was obviously Russia, that only Russia would have the means and motivations to do this, and that European officials are almost all universally pointing at Russia. Well, then you look at the reality. You wind back the clock a year, you wind back the clock even a few months. There's only one party in the world who has been as vociferously opposed to the pipeline's existence. There's only one party who has threatened to ensure that the pipeline does not get completed, and that's the United States. And so the Western press completely ignored the fact that the United States had the largest and loudest and most publicly stated motive to destroy the pipelines. But that's where the media went, and they didn't really go anywhere else. And for a few months, there was silence. There were brief reports emanating from various different sources about a connection between Liz Truss and a text that she may or may not have sent to Anthony Blinken. Now, these were rumors, they were unconfirmed, but they pose a lot of speculation that the UK might have been the operative factor in there. But then time went on, and we still heard more silence. And there were reports that the German government and members of parliament were getting a little restless at the fact that they were generally excluded from the Swedish investigation, and that the Swedes were keeping their investigation pretty close to the chest. And so the Germans, it was even reported that they were open to ideas that the United States was behind the attack, or that members of the West were behind the attack. And then not a week or two after that, you have Seymour Hersh, who is a very decorated journalist, drop a very long and detailed story about his version about how the pipeline was destroyed. And now this was quickly challenged by a lot of people in open source intelligence. They claimed that some of the planes and some of the material that Hersh alleges were being used were not actually there. And Hersh responded to this by saying that, of course, anyone who would carry out this operation would be sure to cover their tracks, that the open source intelligence people wouldn't be able to pin it down. And so you have that debate raging, but you still have the mainstream media almost completely ignoring it. The New York Times, Hersh's former employer, refused to publish anything about this until there was this story about the Ukrainian yacht. There was a story that German investigators had in fact found that a yacht with explosive material residue discovered on it was chartered by 6 individuals, and their patron was a wealthy Ukrainian individual. But the story was thinly sourced. It was U.S. officials, anonymous U.S. officials, citing quote unquote tentative intelligence that this was the case. We received further confirmations. I put that in scare quotes because it's difficult to figure out what's fact and fiction. But we saw more reports in this vein from different sources from around the globe, mostly in the German press, who reported in more detail, citing, again, German investigators. But lately, there was an even newer story that has nothing to do with this old one that's currently being pushed by outlets like Radio Free Europe, that according to the Finnish press, that there was a Danish or a Greek tanker that was seen in the vicinity of the pipeline blast, and in the temporal space that might be related to the attacks. And so you have to sit back and ask, what are all these stories about? What's going on here? Some of these stories are mutually exclusive, such as Seymour Hersh's and that of the New York Times. Maybe there may be overlap. There's still confusion. I don't hear people talking about this alleged text between Liz Truss and Anthony Blinken. But there are a lot of rumors swirling around. And as someone who studies the media, one thing that I'm noticing that is getting completely lost in this is the question of who benefits and why would anyone blow up these pipelines. You still have the New York Times, who's obfuscating the U.S. Motive in all of this. In their piece, they said proudly that Ukraine was one of the chief suspects because they had the most to gain from the Nord Stream pipeline being exploded. Of course, they ignore that the U.S. has suddenly increased its exports of liquid natural gas to Germany exponentially. During the war, Europe became the top recipient of U.S. natural gas, and the Nord Stream pipeline, if it was to ever go back online, and if the Nord Stream 2 was to be completed and official, well, that would definitely threaten these windfall profits from U.S. natural gas companies. But that's been completely left out of discussion. And in fact, the same can be said about Norway, who was, according to Seymour Hersh's account of the explosion, was a critical ally in the carrying out of these pipelines. Well, Norwegian exports to Germany have skyrocketed throughout the war, and destroying the Nord Stream pipeline would help to cement these gains. So there's been a long campaign to sort of muddy the waters and trying to obscure the larger geopolitical stakes involved in this pipeline.
Now, Bryce, we set out to target the Russian banks, and now our banks are collapsing. What's the latest on the dominoes tumbling across the US banking sector? Can you give us in a thumbnail sketch how it's looking?
Well, this is far from my area of expertise, but I can say this. Well, it appears that the U.S. government has once again stepped in to bail out some of the most wealthy individuals in the United States. For those of you who don't know about this story, a bank called Silicon Valley Bank recently experienced a bank run in which depositors tried to take out a bunch of money, but the bank was unable to fulfill these deposits. Well, the U.S. government, Uncle Sam, stepped in and announced that they're going to insure these depositors even over the federal guarantee of $250,000 per depositor. That's the FDIC guarantee. And so what this does is it essentially says to the American people that, well, we can't really bail you out if you're in trouble. Same with the housing crisis, and same with, well, most of the history of neoliberalized America. We can't bail you out. But who we can bail out are the bankers. And who we can bail out are the wealthy depositors who, may or may not have made irresponsible decisions with their money. And so what this is an implicit subsidy to this sector of the economy that says that you can do whatever you want. Uncle Sam will step in and make sure that you're whole, make sure that your profits aren't interrupted. And this has been a long-standing problem. In 2014, I believe, the IMF came out with a study that really found that most, if not all, of American banking profits come from this implicit subsidy, this implicit guarantee that they will be bailed out, this guarantee that if a bank is quote unquote too big to fail, they can't be, they'll be rescued. No one's going to let them fall. And that's what seems to be being reinforced here, is that the U.S. government is working with bankers.
Yeah, no safety net for health, but a hell of a safety net for wealth. Bryce Greene, as always, a real pleasure to talk with you this evening on the mother of all talk shows. Thanks for coming on.